Alright you guys, in this video we're going to be sewing the Juliet dress, which is my newest sewing release pattern that you can find on rosiepenapattern.com. I will walk you through step by step on how to sew this Juliet dress. Remember, you can always pause the video and rewind to go back to any of the clips. And if you have any questions about the sewing process, make sure to leave a comment in the comment box below and I'll be sure to help you out. If this is your first time sewing a print at home pattern, I have a video walking you step by step on how to print and assemble PDF patterns. I'll put a card to that above. For the Juliet dress, we actually only have 2 pattern pieces, but you're going to cut out your main pattern piece 2 times with your main fabric, and then you're going to cut at the cut line for the lining, and you're going to cut that out 2 times also. For your waist ties, you just want to cut those pattern pieces out 2 times. For the waist ties, we're just going to press those with the right sides facing, and we're going to make a crease line using our iron. This is just going to help us later on in the sewing process. This wooden tool that you see me using is called a tailor's clapper. It's definitely not completely necessary. It's just a pressing tool that helps the fibers set into a flatter shape. Now you want to take your waist ties to your sewing machine, and you're just going to sew along one of those short edges and then along the entire length of the waist ties. Repeat that to the other waist tie as well. You just want to trim that seam on the waist ties down to about 1/8 of an inch. You can use your rotary cutter or your fabric scissors. Just trim that seam allowance down on both of your waist ties. Now we're going to use my favorite tool, which is called a bodkin. You can get this at any sewing supply store. I'll have some other great options in the description box below. Just want to place your bodkin inside of your fabric, and then you're going to clip it once you get to the very bottom edge of the fabric. And then you're just going to use that tool to turn the ties with the right sides facing out. Repeat that same exact step to the other waist tie as well. And don't worry if you don't have a bodkin, you can also achieve the same exact step using a safety pin as well. Once you have your waist ties with the right sides facing out, you just want to press that flat at your ironing table, and then you're just going to go ahead and place that to the side while we work on the rest of the dress. We'll bring these back in on a later step. The thing I always like to do whenever I'm working with fabric that looks the same on both sides is after I've cut out my fabric with the right sides facing, before I do anything else, I always mark the wrong side of the fabric using tailor's chalk or a fabric marker or any other fabric marking tool. I just place an X on the wrong sides of the fabric. This way, whenever I'm sewing, I don't get confused on which side of the fabric is the right side or the wrong side. Now I'm going to take one of my main fabric pieces with the right sides facing up, and then I'm going to take my fabric lining piece and place that with the right sides together, and I'm going to pin along the neckline of the fabric. You can use sewing pins or fabric clips. I've been loving using these Wonder clips. I'll have them linked in my description bar below, but I've just found them to be a lot quicker and a lot easier to work with. You can also use sewing pins. Just repeat that same exact step to your other main fabric piece and your lining piece as well, again with the right sides facing and pinning or clipping along that neckline of the fabric. Once you have both of the necklines clipped, just take your fabric to your sewing machine, and you're going to sew along those clipped edges using 1/2 of an inch seam allowance and making sure you're using a stretch stitch. So stretch stitch on your sewing machine, it looks like a lightning bolt, or you can also use a zigzag stitch. And if you use a zigzag stitch, the settings that I found to be really helpful is a 2.0 by a 2.0 or 2.5 by 2.5, but you can play with your fabric beforehand and just see which of the stitches work best with the fabric that you're using. So any scrap fabric pieces that you use, you can always test your stitch length on your fabric before you sew your actual project. Definitely make sure you use a stretch stitch because this is a knit fabric and you want it to stretch over your body. If you use a straight stitch on this, whenever you put this garment on, the stitches on the seam line have a potential to pop, and then your dress is going to fall apart. So make sure that you use a stretch stitch. Trim your seam allowance down to about 1/8 of an inch using your rotary cutter or fabric scissors. Just being careful not to cut through your stitches. Just cut very close, about 1/8 of an inch away. This is just going to reduce some of that bulk along the seam line. Whenever you sew a dress that has a lining, the lining has the potential to peep through to the right side whenever you're wearing it. One way to prevent this is to use your iron to help pull that seam line down closer towards the lining or the inside of your garment and just press that in place. But another thing you can do is understitch. I don't actually do that on this dress pattern, but you can also choose to understitch that seam allowance towards the lining of your fabric. But I'm just going to use my iron to help me with this step. Now we're going to place our fabric with the right sides facing up and that lining opened up all the way as well. As you can see, the whole dress is laid completely flat. I'm going to take my other main fabric and lining pieces that are already attached. I'm going to clip at that seam line and along the shoulders, again with the right sides facing. Then I'm just going to turn my fabric around and do that same exact step. Just clipping evenly at that seam line and then along the shoulder. Once you have your shoulder seams clipped, just take your fabric to your sewing machine and you're going to sew again with a 1/2 inch seam allowance and a stretch stitch, making sure to backstitch at the beginning of your seam and then again at the end of your seam as well. Now just trim those seam allowances down to about 1/8 inch. You just want to take your iron and press all of those seam lines nice and flat. Take your time with this step just to make sure that everything looks nice and neat. You just want to use the burrito method to sew your armholes. So you're just going to have your fabric with the right sides facing up, and then you're going to roll your fabric matching one of the main fabric armhole seam lines to the lining armhole seam line, and you just want to clip that in place. And then you're going to continue clipping along the armhole. Once you have your armhole clipped, just take your fabric to your sewing machine and you're going to sew with 1/2 inch seam allowance. Again, using that stretch stitch, and make sure to backstitch at the beginning and the end of your seams. As you're sewing, make sure that you're not catching any of that extra fabric. You just want to be sewing your armhole piece fabrics together. Done sewing, just trim that down to 1/8 inch and then press that seam flat with your iron. You want to turn your fabric with the right sides facing out again, and then you just want to repeat that same exact step to your other armhole seam as well, matching that main armhole seam line to the lining armhole seam line, and then just continue pinning or clipping along the armhole. Once you have your armhole clipped, just take your fabric to your sewing machine and you're going to sew with 1/2 inch seam allowance. Again, using that stretch stitch, and make sure to backstitch at the beginning and the end of your seams. As you're sewing, make sure that you're not catching any of that extra fabric. You just want to be sewing your armhole piece fabrics together. Trim that seam allowance down to about 1/8 inch, and then you just want to turn your dress with the right sides facing out, and then you're just going to press that flat with your iron, again making sure that everything looks nice and neat. Now it's time to sew our side seams in place. So you want to just place your fabric with the right sides facing, and you're going to pin along that lining side seam and along that main side seam piece as well, just like you see me doing here. And you also want to bring your waist ties in now, and you're going to match those waist ties at the notch that you should have transferred from your pattern piece onto your fabric. Just want to place your waist ties inside of your fabric, again with the right sides facing, and you just want to clip that in place at that notch marking. Continue pinning or clipping along the entire length of the side seam, and just repeat that to the other side seam as well, making sure to use your other waist tie as well. Again, just matching that waist tie at that notch marking from your pattern piece onto your fabric. Just clip that in place inside of your seam line. That you have both of your side seams pinned or clipped, just take your fabric to your sewing machine, and you want to sew with 1/2 inch seam allowance, making sure that you're using that stretch stitch. Backstitch at the beginning and the end of your seams, and just remove those clips as you go. Once you've sewn your side seams in place, the very last step is to hem your dress if you choose. So just try on your dress and determine how much you want to hem. And then you just want to press that fabric to the wrong side, and you're going to sew that in place. So this is a knit fabric and it doesn't fray. So I actually left the hem of this dress unfinished. You can choose to sew the hem, or you can leave it unfinished as I did. But that's it, you're all done with your Juliet dress. I hope you enjoyed this tutorial. Make sure to visit the website so you can grab your pattern. You can go to rosiepenapattern.com and search for the Juliet dress. I hope you guys enjoyed this tutorial. Thank you so much for watching. Make sure to subscribe for more fun sewing projects, and I'll see you in my next video. Bye guys!